Okay, well, I don't think we're going to have any attendance this evening because we're coming off of spring break. So I do want to spend a little bit of time and cover a particular PowerPoint that I think is valuable to us. So let me start with this. When we look at firms, and it almost doesn't matter which firm it is, whether it's a Wall Street firm, whether it's a manufacturing firm, whether it's higher education for that matter, we find more and more that the trend has been over the last probably 40 years, increasing over time. So it's a positive or it's an upward trend that layoffs and retrenchments and whatever the wording might be come more and more frequently after the long tenure of service with the firm. The firm's perspective, of course, is it's business and it's a necessity of business, and there are financial exigencies and so forth. The employee's perspective is oftentimes pretty different for obvious reasons. There is the argument that the organization lacks loyalty, and that's not an uncommon perspective. The organization lacks loyalty. I would suggest that, and we'll speak more about it in this few minutes we have to share together. It used to be a bit different, but firms no longer prioritize long term employee relationships. Now, some of that may seem cruel, but the other side of that is that technology and other things change so quickly that there is a constant desire by the firm to bring in new talent with new skills. And perhaps the legacy employees have not kept up on the changes in skills, the latest of which is AI. So, excuse me, many, for example, universities have this ongoing debate, recent but ongoing, regarding the use of AI for faculty and students, and some still consider it cheating. Others consider it the current state of affairs in terms of technology and tools available to both faculty and students. And so this might be an example of where the organization eventually has to take a position that supports the notion that, hey, you know what, AI is current. And if you're part of the old crew, the old guard, and you absolutely cannot abide this, whether the argument is the loss of or lack of the so-called productive struggle of students and so forth, whatever the rationale, you've got to go with the times. And if you're not able to do that, then things have to change. Now, when these things happen, when employees, especially legacy or older, more tenured employees, are rift, reduction in force, retrenched, fired, given a pink slip, however you want to phrase it, it creates tremendous uncertainty. It creates financial hardship, tremendous emotional distress, and frankly, career uncertainty, especially if you're a legacy employee. Let's say you're 50 years old or older. As much as we say, well, can't discriminate based on age, I mean, that's pretty nonsensical. I think we all know better. There's a psychological contract with a firm. And while this may seem a bit soft science for business students, think about it for a minute. We have an expectation, and I think we're brought up with the expectation that if we work hard, do good, stay loyal to the firm, they'll be loyal to us. And this is one of those unwritten, non contractual things, especially in an at will environment. And these unwritten expectations between the employer and the employee are broken more and more and frequently. And we hear, I mean, absurd phrases like, well, that's just not fair, as if there were some kind of a standard to that. But there is a psychological contract. There is an expectation, and I think we're brought up with that expectation. And I'm here to somewhat dissuade that. We're here to kind of assess that the expectation that we might have, this psychological contract, in other words, do as you would have others do unto you. Well, I'm not so certain that that applies in business. And, we can argue that mean old bad business, but we can also argue that, look, we're business students and we have to understand that the exigencies and needs of the firm come first. So this psychological contract, these unwritten expectations, are they misplaced expectations and derived from where? Well, probably derived from business schools that have an unrealistic view of the world, business schools that take more of a soft science preference to the hard, callous nature of business sometimes, recognizing the STEM aspects, the needs of the firm, versus the soft science aspects, the aspirational things of warmth and brotherhood and sisterhood, and you get the idea. Some case examples, because large corporations continue and are conducting mass layoffs despite profitability, and this is especially true in the tech sector. Meta announced a big reduction in force. I mean, something on the order of 21 or 31,000, I forget the exact number now, employees. And it's not because of financial exigency. It's because they found other ways to do this. They're incorporating AI, which is eliminating a lot of coding positions, et cetera, et cetera. Automation and outsourcing is a big factor in all of this, but this is not new. In point of fact, this is what I did for years. Would go into firms like Eastman Kodak, Parker Hannifin, Stryker, you name the firm, not just the Fortune 200 firms, but Fortune 500 firms and firms, all over the world, frankly. And the idea was replace workers with technology, and there was always the outsourcing option of cheaper labor, which many firms took advantage of. But what I did was replace workers with technology. Don't got to pay benefits or legacy benefits to technology. Don't have to give them days off. You get the idea. And this was done, excuse me, through things like factory automation. One of the examples I used was Xerox up in New York State was a client of mine, and they had a comparable sister facility, Fuji Xerox in Japan. We were able to justify and install a flexible manufacturing cell at the time I was doing this, but at the same time at the sister facility, they were able to justify an entire lights out factory automated system. Now, the implications for labor were obvious, the implications for employee layoffs. I mean, that was all obvious. Well, what was the driver and what was the difference between Fuji Xerox and Xerox here in the States? Add to this AI, artificial intelligence integration, and you start to see where we are. There's something called a gig economy or a gig approach to doing business. And we know what a gig is. If you play a guitar and, back many, 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 many years ago, I had a high school band like many others did. And I played a little bit of guitar, probably haven't touched it in over 50 years. And, I may pick it up, you never know. But the point being that, we would do a gig, somebody's birthday party, maybe a very small wedding or something like this. Actually used to play in the church as well. Point being that we all, I think, understand what a gig is. And so there is a shift towards this gig approach to business, a shift toward contract work, 1099 work, in terms of the IRS, and reduced job security that goes along with it. In higher ed here at the university, we see it in the form of something called an NTTP. We used to hire professors on a tenure track, and after so many years and jumping through so many hoops, you achieve tenure. And tenure meant, a bunch of things. Not that you couldn't be let go or couldn't be fired, but it gave you some preferences or preferential treatment, if you want to look at it that way. Well, the idea of NTTP is non-tenure track professor or professional, depending on how you want to interpret the acronym. And so the NTTP is a way of saying, hey, look, this way we're not locked in. We don't have to keep you. You're not going to achieve tenure, so the rights that come with that and so forth. And the other biggie is adjunct professors. Most often cheaper to hire an adjunct to teach than a tenure track full professor that's been around for a while that gets a decent paycheck. Another example of this gig approach is hiring consultants. Oftentimes we had, some years back, and I won't get into the specifics, but different programs that were being assessed as to the viability and the profitability and so forth. Uh, we didn't really want to allocate the money to employees or dedicate employee time at these higher pay rates. So we went out and we would pay $3,000, $3,500, $5,000 to a so-called consultant to come in and say what we were all saying, sitting around the table. But it was arguably arm's length. It was arguably objective, at least until you understand what the purpose of a consultant is. And I'm not being too cynical when I say the purpose of a consultant is to get a paycheck and then to get that next paycheck. And I've done some consulting with some larger institutions, Salvation Army being one, formerly Alliance University being one. I've actually done some consulting work, some of it pro bono for New Jersey City University and the AFT local. The point being, this gig approach is arguably cheaper, and so it's embraced by business. We purchase research and development. We don't need to have these big departments. We purchase HR, human resources and payroll services through companies like ADP and Paychecks and others. So this gig approach has gained popularity and continues to be increasingly popular. Ethical considerations is a hard one to debate because there is this debate over corporate responsibility to employees. Now, recognize, at least in the state of New Jersey, or as I refer to it, the Communist Republic of New Jersey, this idea of responsibility to employees, Jersey is an at-will state, meaning that you can be fired for any reason or no reason. Somebody just doesn't like somebody, as long as you're not fired for being in one of the protected classes. And then if you're involved with a collective bargaining, a union, for example, or something, and you have a collective bargaining agreement, well, that comes into play as well. But it's also driven, excuse me, by the so-called ethical theories, the moral ethical theories that really drive the debate. Theories that surround the notion of utilitarianism, theories that surround the notion of ethical egoism, cultural relativism, and many more. Change the theory that's applied, and you change the outcome, or the, how should I phrase it, the perspective of good and bad and right and wrong, and so forth. Corporate social responsibility. Sounds great, right? Sounds good when you say it fast. The argument ensues, should firms protect long-term employees? Well, the minute you hear the word should, what should resonate is the notion of something called the fallacy of shoulds. A fallacy of shoulds. It's a dynamic that suggests an overlay of someone's own, perhaps personal, moral, ethical position on things. Because, under what moral ethical theory should something be done, or in the alternate, not be done? So anytime you hear the word should, we're normatizing. We're not analyzing, we're normatizing. We're overlaying our own personal sense of beliefs and right and wrong and good and bad, et cetera, et cetera. And then the idea of protecting employees, this notion of protection is a moving target. I'm a pretty well-educated person, but I'm not sure I can tell you what it actually means. protecting employees. And that's for larger debate, and we'll discuss that more in class. Employee trust issues. Well, let's face it. When there's blood in the aisles, when people are being let go, retrenched, whatever word you choose to use, I mean, it doesn't just affect morale, it crashes morale and engagement with the organization. It destroys this sense of entrepreneurship, this sense of ownership of the firm. Look, we may not own the firm, but the C-suite would love us to adopt a perspective that says, look, we act and we treat things in almost a fiduciary kind of way because we are, in quotes, owners of this firm. We're part of it. We're part of this family. Well, nothing crashes all of that than getting rid of long-term employees, retrenchment or other. Impact on workplace culture? Well, fear, disengagement, reduced loyalty, lower productivity typically, poor retention, and then the firms get hit with and absorb all the costs associated with retraining and replacement, even if that replacement is employing technology or buying technology. Now, the legal perspective, well, we're going to sidestep most of this because it varies a bit from state to state. There are federal guidelines, there are state guidelines, even here in the Communist Republic of New Jersey. But, it is an at-will employment state that allows for termination without cause. Most contracts minimally protect employees these days, especially so-called union contracts. And great examples of unions that probably at one point were pretty valuable and pretty solid and pretty good at what they did. Well, that's in a past life, but American Federation of Teachers, the ICBEW, electrical, and even the trucking industry, AFL-CIO, and others, and many others. So there is a legal perspective that incorporates the idea of collective bargaining and collective bargaining agreements, but it's not like the old days of Jimmy Hoffa. And if you watch the movie, there's probably a lot of truth to that. Well, arguments from firms. Well, the biggest one is we need flexibility. We need this ability. We can't be tied into contracts and legacy systems and so forth, because to compete and survive, especially in a global environment, we need to be nimble and flexible and so forth. There is truth to that. But the idea of balancing profit and people, that's a tough one. Finding sustainable approaches to workforce management, good luck with that. I mean, that's the aspirational stuff that I suspect dreams are made of. Remember that firms, especially firms in the for-profit arena, publicly traded under our, let's call it, brand of capitalism, this American or Western brand of capitalism, have a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders, the owners of the firm. And they must, to the best of their ability, follow something called the business judgment rule, which has a lot to it. But when you simplify the interpretation, basically they're saying, look, you got to look out for the owners of the firm. That's top priority. And that's a responsibility of the C-suite, CEO, CFO, COO, and enforced, reportedly, by the board of directors, because they have the governance oversight and the fiduciary responsibility to oversee what the managers of the firm are doing. And is it consistent with the business judgment rule to the maximum advantage of the owners of the firm, AKA the shareholders? Well, potential solutions. And this is a little bit of myth versus reality. Potential solutions suggest, I need to take a sip of water for this one. They suggest that a kind of optimal solution, or perhaps something less than optimal, but a solution nonetheless, is the idea of severance, the idea of retraining, and the idea of ethical leadership being incorporated into all of this. Well, severance. You've worked here 40 years, up to a maximum number. We're going to award you 1 week of pay for every year that you've worked here. So if you've worked here for 40 years, we're going to give you a severance of 40 weeks of pay. That's not even a year. Not even a year. And once you are severed from the firm, benefits are cut off. Of course, you can COBRA the benefits. But if you've ever looked at the price of COBRA, I mean, it's astronomical. So you're going to lose your benefits. You're going to lose different things that are not able to be carried over unless you are protected contractually, or a very few things under federal labor law. So the idea that severance as a potential solution, you know what? That's almost like the final straw. It's almost like the last thumb in the eye. I mean, it sounds good when you say it fast, but the reality is far from what is represented by, well, we take care of our employees and we offer them a generous severance. A generous severance would be, you give me 5 years of my current pay and cover my benefits, because that's how long it's going to take me to find suitable replacement employment. But that would never happen, or rarely, if ever, happen. Retraining. Well, that's also code in a sense, euphemism perhaps, that suggests that, well, there's nothing you can do that is valuable to us, so we're going to try and train you in something else. But of course, you being not an expert in that area, lacking experience in that area, your pay grade, or your employment slot is going to go from here to here. So you're starting over basically as a new employee, unless you have an agreement in a contract that suggests otherwise. So again, another thumb in the eye. And ethical leadership will leave for another slide, perhaps another slide presentation later in the semester. So the reality is a de minimis severance, the offer of retraining, which usually comes with a reduction in pay, and ethical leadership is such an abstraction that it could potentially mean anything to anyone, and mean anything that we might want it to mean. Future of work, well, evolving expectations and a demand for fairness. Now, fairness is probably the largest abstraction on the planet. I just don't know what that means. Of course, we all have our own personal sense, but can you imagine 1,000 people with their own initiatives standing in a circle debating each other as to what is fair? Well, you may as well, walk into an arena, pull the pin on a smoke bomb or, grenade or something, and watch the chaos, because that's what you're creating. AI, as in terms of the future of work, will eliminate jobs, to be sure, especially the more mundane jobs and so forth. I don't need a teaching assistant to create a PowerPoint or slideshow for me. I can make a slideshow like this using ChatGPT in about 10 minutes. And that includes an awful lot of editing and artful design and so forth. So AI eliminates jobs, but it does create some other opportunities. A lot of those are engineering oriented, and in terms of corporate and or computer or cyber security, a lot of things come in that arena as well. Well, what is lost in the process is this thing called the productive struggle. So the productive struggle, I'll just give you an example as it applies to academia, higher education. There is an argument that says, well, we don't need universities anymore because students can just basically plug in at the house and sit there and go through all these slides and listen to these videos and punch in an online exam and get a diploma. There you go, or the equivalent of a diploma. But when you go out to the workforce, and frankly, you could send out 10,000 resumes and not get a single bite. because it is always the personal interaction that gets you the interview and perhaps subsequently the job in almost every case. But here's the thing. You go before somebody, and yes, you can sit back and say, look, on my resume, I have all this cool stuff that I've done, and I told you about this, and look over here, I've done that. And then you express that same stuff in the interview. An employer or potential employer doesn't need to read that. Of course, they'll read your resume and all of this, and they'll have a nice, polite conversation with you. But what is not said, what you have not said, this potential employer already knows. If you've gone through undergrad and it took you 4 or 5 years, you did a whole bunch of stuff consistently for 4 years or 5 years or however long it took. You didn't give up. You passed the courses, you got the grades, and you got a diploma. Productive struggle. It demonstrates your tenacity. It demonstrates your ability to succeed. It demonstrates your ability to stick with something, et cetera, et cetera. I think you get my meaning. And if you've gone on to higher degrees, an MBA perhaps, it demonstrates more of the productive struggle. So you're telling an employer just by virtue of having gone through that, without talking about your degree, the specialization, the courses, or any of this other stuff, you've already told them an awful lot about you. AI records and emulates the repository of learning. The repository of learning in any firm is its human resources, processes, the improvements, the innovative, intent, and so forth. And so AI records and emulates that. But remember, garbage in, garbage out. AI is not a free thinking brain. AI is like a great big recorder. It copies. It's almost like a Wikipedia on steroids. Whatever gets put in, true, untrue, biased in whatever direction or directions, etc. This is what's there. This is what's being regurgitated back to you. Chinese have a word for it called shanzai, and it is the descriptive of copying or creating knockoff. That is the essence of AI. So to conclude, there's a need for balance between firm success and employee well-being. But I have to tell you, that's aspirational at best. Business is capitalist and it's cutthroat. Fairness is an abstraction that has become virtually meaningless in business today. We'll talk more about this, but I hope this gives you an intro and a little primer into some of what we'll be speaking about in the next couple of weeks. With that, I'm going to stop share. Those of you that were here, thank you. I'm going to stop recording and I'll make this available.